slavery played the central role during the American Civil War. The primary catalyst for secession was slavery, especially Southern political leaders' resistance to attempts by Northern anti-slavery political forces to block the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. Slave life went through great changes as the South saw Union armies take control of broad areas of land. During and before the war, enslaved people played an active role in their own emancipation, and thousands of enslaved people escaped from bondage during the war. On January 1, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation, making 3 million blacks legally free. During the war, both sides used African Americans for military purposes, in the South as enslaved labor, and in the North as wage labor and military volunteers. Over 100,000 formerly enslaved people fought for the Union, and over 500,000 fled their plantations for Union lines. Religiosity and cultural expression also developed greatly during the Civil War. Demographics and economics. There have been many different ways to estimate the amount of slaveholding in the South. In 1860, 1.6% of U.S. citizens owned slaves. Most of the South's enslaved workers were enslaved by planters, often defined as those who enslaved 20 or more people, although yeoman farmers outnumbered planters, which numbered fewer than 50,000. Southern agriculture was more lucrative than Northern, focusing on crops of rice, cotton, and sugar. Even before the war, in the rice regions of Georgia and South Carolina, and in parts of the Mississippi Delta, there were 10 or even 20 enslaved black people for every white person. During the war, this disparity grew, leading to fear of insurrection and calls for militia companies to be stationed in agricultural regions to guarantee peace. The market for buying and selling enslaved people continued during the war, as did the market for hiring and hiring out enslaved labor. Although the price of enslaved workers grew, it did not keep up with inflation, causing the real price of enslaved people to decline during the Civil War. The prices of people held in slavery rose and fell in part with the prospects for Confederate victory. Culture. Opportunities for cultural expression grew as autonomy for slaves increased during the war. Christianity grew among enslaved people and freedmen during and immediately after the Civil War. Organizations such as the American Missionary Association sent missionaries into Union-occupied areas where they formed religious congregations and led revivals. Music sung by African Americans changed during the war. The theme of escape from bondage became especially important in spirituals sung by blacks, both by enslaved people singing among themselves on plantations and for free and recently freed blacks singing to white audiences. New versions of songs such as Hail Mary emphasized the message of freedom and the rejection of slavery. Feelings of whites about slavery during this period has also been the subject of study. Generally poor, non-slaveholding whites in the South admired planters and sought to own slaves themselves. During the war, Confederate soldiers were optimistic about the prospects for the survival of the Confederacy and the institution of slavery well into 1864. The North was not united against slavery, and many Union troops desired that the United States, win or lose, be a white man's country. However, it was clear to all that Lincoln's party, the Republican Party, was in favor of eventual if not immediate emancipation. Slaves in the Confederate service. The Confederacy's early military successes depended significantly on slavery. Slaves provided agricultural and industrial labor, constructed fortifications, repaired railroads, and freed up white men to serve as soldiers. Tens of thousands of slaves were used to build and repair fortifications and railroads, teamsters, ditch diggers, and assisting medical workers. The role of slavery on the size of the Confederate Army was complicated. While the use of slave labor in camps freed white soldiers to fight, the population was said to be more willing to send their white men to the army than risk the life and labor of their slaves. The Confederate Congress passed a slave impressment law on March 26, 1863. This law raised questions about whether or not the Confederacy could seize free blacks. Even before the government authorized the impressment of slaves, officers forced thousands of slaves to work, and the scale of slave projects during the war was greater than those present on plantations. Near the end of the war, the Confederacy made efforts to enlist black soldiers. In November 1864, Confederate President Jefferson Davis called on the Confederate Congress to purchase 40,000 slaves, who would then be emancipated in return for military service. Contraband. At the outset of the war, Abraham Lincoln hoped to keep the Union intact with or without slavery. Early in the war, Northern generals hesitated to aid escaping slaves. But as early as May 1861, Union General Benjamin F. Butler, in command at Fort Monroe, Virginia, unilaterally refused to return escaped slaves who reached federal lines to their slave owners. Instead, Butler employed them in the quartermaster department, reasoning that returning the slaves would aid the enemy, and the Grand Contraband Camp, Virginia, was formed. The escaped slaves came to be known as contraband, and over 200,000 such individuals came to work for the Union Army. Initially, contraband worked as teamsters, blacksmiths, cooks, coopers, carpenters, bakers, butchers, laundresses, personal servants, and performed other menial duties. On the other hand, some Union Army generals kept a practice of returning escaped slaves to their masters, particularly Democrats such as Generals Henry Halleck and George B. McClellan. Emancipation. Executive and legislative efforts to end slavery started early in the war. During 1861 and 1862, Lincoln proposed plans of compensated emancipation for slaves. After the repeated rejection of compensated emancipation plans, Lincoln began to contemplate a presidential emancipation decree in mid-1862. On July 17, 1862, Congress passed the Militia Act, which emancipated Confederate bondsmen employed by the Union Army and authorized the President to receive blacks into service. That same day, Congress passed the Second Confiscation Act, which authorized the emancipation of slaves of people engaged in rebellion. Lincoln was slow to enact the provisions of the Second Confiscation Act, which was criticized by abolitionists, particularly Frederick Douglass. On July 21, 1862, 4 days after signing the Militia and Second Confiscation Acts, Lincoln met with his cabinet to inform them that he intended to implement the military and emancipation provisions of the acts, but not the colonization, and the next day he shared with the cabinet the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Aftermath. At the beginning of 1865, millions of black people remained as slaves, but the institution was crumbling. As the Confederate Army weakened, the Confederacy's ability to assert racial control lessened, and large numbers of slaves were escaping to federal lines every day. At the war's end, some Southern whites fled to South America where they could escape federal law, and in some cases, continue slaveholding, although such cases were the exception. Slaves saw emancipation as more than an end to slavery, but also education, voting rights, and rights before the law. The 13th Amendment passed in January 1865, ending slavery in the Union and ensuring that under U.S. control, slaves in the South would be freed. Blacks living in the South were no longer slaves, but most remained and worked for their former masters.
Learn Black history, teach Black history. Visit us at BlackFacts.com.